Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi on News That Matters. I've not been able to do my last week's episode, so I'm going to kind of try and cram up a lot of little news items within this episode to cover up for some stuff that we could have missed. I have updates for India, Pakistan, China, and of course the Ukraine war, along with general updates of various geopolitical events that have happened around the world. Let's start with India. I think one of the biggest newsmakers in India recently is this Agniveer protest. I'm not going to get into the merits or the demerits of this entire scheme that has been launched by the Indian Armed Forces and the government of India. Having said that, I'd like to just mention that these protests that are happening today, and we see them as a regular visitor to our lives, seems to be a very well thought out plan to destabilize and internally show weaknesses within India. The one of the biggest things that India has been able to show to the world, which has basically allowed us to kind of get our way within various things, is internal strength. And when we see weaknesses of these kind within India, it's very difficult to project an outward strength. Let's hope these things die down and the damage to public property is avoided at all costs. Going forward with India, I'm going to talk about something very nice. The UPI is going global after Singapore, Nepal, Bhutan, UAE. Now, France has also decided and is in talks with India to set up and accept UPI and RuPay payments. That is very interesting news that talks about Indian financial reach reaching abroad, and we're able to use these facilities as in India abroad as well. One of the things that has made much of headlines in the past week has been the factor that India has been importing crude oil from Russia. Russia has become somewhere the second largest exporter of oil to India. Another interesting report that came out from the CREA, and I'll put up a screenshot here for all of you to read. It talks about India is actually importing quite a certain amount of Russian oil to re-export it to countries like the US, France, Italy, and the UK, basically certain other nations in the European Union as well. Many people would have a little bit of an ethical problem with that. Well, I guess if they don't mind it, nor should we. Moving forward, oil is basically becoming a game. This whole war is about two things today. It's about the military operations which are taking place in Ukraine, and of course the economic and the oil wars which are also taking place on the side. One thing that I can tell you is with the reduction of oil coming in from the Middle East, there might be certain blowbacks, as we saw with the episode of some remarks that were made on Prophet Muhammad. A lot of this particular thing was carried up by Al Jazeera, and we need to be careful. I'd like to also take a minute to mention about the killings of civilians or targeted killings that have been taking place in Kashmir. Seems to be another ploy to destabilize that entire region, looking at the factor that the amount of investment and the other development things, activities that are taking place in the valley. It's interesting to note that the kind of attacks that are taking place show you a certain amount of desperation. It shows you a certain amount of lack of training within the terrorists, because the incidents of long ranged encounters are reducing day by day. I've done a video on my channel with Lieutenant General Ravi Shankar and Lieutenant General Satish Dua on this particular subject. I'd like you to check it out. India recently has been putting a lot of focus into the Southeast Asia region. One of the things that we saw was India signed up a logistic pact with Vietnam to allow both the militaries of both the sides to use each other's bases for repair and replenishment of supplies. That's a very interesting thing, apart from certain developments which are also taking place recently last week when Minister Jaishankar met his counterparts from the ASEAN countries, almost 9 of them, if I'm not mistaken. It also signifies India's focus into the maritime policy, and this is something which is very interesting to me. There is a little bit of a study I'm doing on this and working on a video with someone who's going to explain to us the pivot of India into the maritime world and why it is important. As far as the Chinese are concerned, we've been hearing that there has been a move in terms of getting the next round of talks going between India and China at the core commander level, but we don't see that moving. There's been a lot of news about Chinese developing their infrastructure, that proverbial bridge on Pangong Tso, a couple of airports in the depth in Tibet, and so on and so forth. In lieu of that, the Indian Armed Forces are forming commands or groups, which are going to be called the Tetra groups. This group include personnel from the Shillong-based Eastern Air Command, Kolkata-based Eastern Army Command, the Naval Eastern Command based out of Visakhapatnam, and the Combined Defense Command of Andaman and Nicobar Islands. That's an interesting move to basically be ready for any Chinese misadventures along the line of actual control, and I mean the entire border. India's position and the centrality of India is something that I've discussed with General Ravi Shankar in terms of the rise of India and how India is becoming a swing state as far as the world geopolitics is concerned. On that note, we had a sort of a statement that was given by the White House Indo-Pacific advisor, Mr. Kurt Campbell, who talks about and says, and I quote, relations with India are the most important for the United States for the 21st century. He was discussing this with regards to the US strategy to compete with China in the Indo-Pacific. The next thing that I'd like to talk to you about is a bit concerning to me. Noida police raided sort of a place, a building, which turned out to be a Chinese-only club. They arrested about 20 Chinese nationals living illegally, and they had machines to forge various Indian identity documents. It is suspected to be a Chinese spy ring, and as far as some information that I have, the IB and the NIA are looking into this entire story. Moving on to Pakistan, always an eventful country. The first big thing I think a lot of Indians were shocked about was that the news of Pakistan being removed from the Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF. At this moment, that's what it seems. At the first level, they are happy with what Pakistan has been able to achieve, and this complete removal of the FATF, complete removal of Pakistan from the FATF grey list would happen after a site visit done by FATF officials in October. Knowing Pakistan, much can happen in these 3-4 months. One thing that I'd like to say is, since Imran Khan's government has left, there has been a little bit of a development in terms of Pakistan's standing within the international community. The current Shahbaz Sharif government, I'm not pro them or against them, but they have made certain inroads within USA. They've made a little bit of an inroad in the Middle East, and they've been trying to sort out their issues with the IMF as well. It's interesting, all these things started moving forward post Imran Khan left. He's not sitting quiet. He's been calling out for dharnas and elections and this and that. There seems to be a little bit of a difference of opinion in terms of how many people actually attend his jalsas or dharnas or whatever you may like to call it. A lot of people seem to believe that he's kind of lost a little bit of a focus. One thing that I'd like to tell you about this entire thing is that Imran Khan somewhere made a strategic mistake, and he could have actually got what he wanted, which is the elections, by announcing the Long March on the 25th of last month. What happened was that just 2 days around that time, the Shahbaz Sharif government was just about to go. If you all remember, Shahbaz Sharif had traveled to London to meet his brother to basically seal the deal of their departure. But I guess Imran Khan announcing that long march would have strengthened their internal core and said, if we kind of leave right now, it will be so that we have got scared of Imran Khan. And I don't think that's something they would want to see. Between China and Pakistan, it's an interesting game always. The Chinese have formally told the Pakistanis that a Chinese private military company run by the MSS, which is Chinese secret services sort of a agency, which will be deployed in Pakistan, securing Chinese interests and Chinese nationals. This tells you how much of a say Pakistan has in its so-called dream CPEC projects. Talking about Pakistan and China again, the Pakistani Navy have these Chinese-made frigates, which are called the F-22P. These have been suffering from major technical defaults. For example, they've been talking about faulty gyroscopes, dysfunctional radars, sonars, and non-working IR systems. Well, it's funny that, the Chinese on one hand, and I'm going to discuss this when I talk about China, have just launched a new aircraft carrier, and their blood brothers or iron brothers are talking about problems with the Chinese frigates. There was a story that came out some time back, but it was literally just died down. It talked about the Pakistani finance minister having forgotten about $7 billion of their international debt. This debt was supposedly belonging to China and the IMF. This story came up and it just died down. Now, I'm not able to kind of verify whether this particular thing is true or not, but it just tells you how interesting the events are in Pakistan. Imran Khan recently uh, mentioned something very interesting. He talked about the fact that if financial stability is going to go low, the army is going to go weak, and there will be a focus on nuclear weapons of Pakistan, and the country will split into three. Now, that is something very interesting because nuclear weapons and splitting the country has not been discussed publicly by any of these politicians in any of these kind of forums. One of the things they stay away from, and Imran Khan basically rung the bell and talked about these three things. I'm going to talk to you about the significance of this entire thing with General Ravi Shankar. I'm working on a video with him. We're just trying to study what is the history and if there is a possibility of the Pakistan actually going into a sort of a disarray. Austerity measures are the name of the game, and we've seen them happening before in Pakistan. I just wanted to brush your memory back when I'd like you to remember when Imran Khan took office. He was trying to sell cows and buffaloes that were being kept in the prime minister's office. He was selling certain cars that were kept in the prime minister's residence. And one of the things that the Pakistanis are trying to do now is to ban weddings post 10 p.m. and try and shut off their markets post 8:30. Every government in Pakistan comes out and tries to do certain austerity measures, but ends up doing the same exact things as what the previous one was doing. For example, Imran Khan used to go to and fro from his house to the office, reportedly in a helicopter. The Pakistanis have been hiking petrol prices like crazy. I mean, it's basically gone up almost 100 rupees in the past about week and a half or two. The last rise that we saw was about 24 rupees for petrol and about 59 rupees for diesel. Seems a little steep, but I guess if they want to go through the IMF, that is something that they'll need to do. Before I shift to, talking about the news updates from China, I'd like to also talk about a Pakistan-China, sort of a partnership which played out in the UN a couple of days ago when the Chinese blocked an Indian move to designate Hafiz Saeed's relative, whose name is Abdul Rahman Maki, as a UN designated terrorist. The funny thing was, post this, the Pakistanis tried to name an Indian in the United Nations Security Council as a terrorist, which was shot down by India, of course, and various other UNSC members. China, of course, was left out. I was telling you about the Chinese having released their third aircraft carrier. Many experts believe that this aircraft carrier is not fully ready, and even the second one is not fully ready for operations. Nevertheless, they have released it and they've named it after the district which is closest to Taiwan, called Fujian. It's interesting when they actually name something on the place where maximum amount of the effort would be done in case of a potential invasion of Taiwan. The former finance minister of China, his name, of course, I'm sorry, is going to be a little difficult for me to pronounce, but I'll try my best, is Liu Zhuwai. He says that the ill-advised zero-COVID restrictions have led to major distractions in the Chinese economy. And he talks about actually rethinking the entire Chinese effort with regards to COVID, trying to balance their economic growth, because what they see right now is actually not what they want. The Shangri-La dialogue, which happened in Singapore, had the Chinese defense minister giving sermons to the world about brotherly existence, about territorial integrity, and a lot many other things that the Chinese themselves don't follow. It's an interesting, series of events. He also actually went out to mention that if there is any sort of support or any call for independence or any military intervention done by the US within Taiwan, they will fight to the end. And those were the words used by the Chinese. A lot of thought process has been going into the Chinese military. The only scary factor that comes out of the recent events that have taken place in the South China Sea and close to North Korea was that the Chinese actually intercepted a Canadian reconnaissance aircraft and a Australian military aircraft as well. The dangerous things about these little incidents that take place, that these things could result into a military mistake, and these military mistakes could be very costly. I'd like you to take your minds back to Galwan, where a skirmish for one border post could have landed up into a major incident between India and China. There's been rumors of the Chinese expanding their naval bases within the Solomon Islands. There have been efforts made by the Americans and the Australians to kind of wade that away. But recently, we've seen that the Chinese have also started working in a base in Cambodia in a place called Ream. Now, this is interesting because this particular base would cover a couple of their choke points within that entire region. The Chinese are denying it, the Cambodians are denying it, but one can only wait till the time things actually move forward. There has been news of an expansion of intelligence base within Taiwan. I think one of the lessons that has been learnt by the United States in the Ukraine war is good on-ground intelligence of any military activity of the opposing army should give a smaller army an edge in terms of fighting that larger force. My only thought in this particular thing would be India must try and collaborate at whatever level possible. For the first time, BBC has put out a report that the Chinese population is set to shrink as I said, for the first time in 60 years. On this particular subject, Elon Musk, he said that China will lose 40% of its population every generation, around 30 years. DevTalks has been talking about the Chinese population decline and the pressures in terms of their demographics for almost a year. You can please go through our China Watch series and you see multiple detailed discussions done on this particular subject. Reports of Shanghai and Beijing having increase in COVID cases are spreading. And as a matter of fact, just before I started this video, I got a news update about a particular hotel being sealed up in Macau with about 700 people stuck inside because one or two COVID cases were discovered there. The interesting thing about China and its international relations is something that we're seeing are becoming a bit strained. There was huge ties between the European Union and the Chinese. The last EU-China summit wasn't that peaceful. As a matter of fact, the EU Parliament has gone across and said the treatment of Uyghurs within China is at a serious risk of a genocide. This comes at the background of the United Nations Human Rights Watch chief going into China, visiting East Turkestan or Xinjiang, and giving China a clean chit. Now, who do we believe? God alone knows. Another very sad story, as a matter of fact, that came out of China, apart from the big, huge floods which are coming across in the southeast region of China, which is basically inundating cities after cities today, is that people in the Hainan province have been refused to take out larger sums of money from their bank account. But a lot of the critics actually talk about a reduction in Chinese money flow, and they're trying to restrict people from taking Chinese money abroad, because that is something that they see happening probably, because we've seen a certain amount of brain drain coming out of China, and the applications for immigration increasing up to about 20 or 25%, as per a report that came out sometime in April. As per Goldman Sachs, and this is the last news bit for China, there are about 22 large real estate companies in China that are about to go tail up the same way that the Evergrande did. And that, my friends, will cause a huge amount of churn in an as it is deteriorating world economy. I don't know what will it result to, but let's wait and watch. As far as the Ukraine war is concerned, things are going bad for the Ukrainian army, where the Ukrainians themselves are admitting losing about 1,000 men a day, killed or wounded. That's a huge number for any army to kind of take take on in terms of a battle that is, taking place in one part of their country. We see the Ukrainians kind of, struggling to keep their heads up in Donbass, where the Russians are basically fighting a war of attrition. I think in that frustration, the Ukrainians have been firing a huge amount of artillery shells and rockets into the city of Donetsk, which is the capital of, the DPR, the Donetsk People's Republic. And there's been a bit of a hue and cry with regards shelling of civilian areas, which is being done by the people of that region, the leadership of that region, and of course, Russia as well. I'd like to actually take a moment to kind of discuss the changing narratives coming out of that war. And, we had NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, who had said Ukraine might have to give up and adjust to the factor that they might have to give up a certain amount of territory to resolve this dispute. Just about a week later, they come out and say, the Ukraine war may last for years. We'll have to, keep this thing going by supporting Ukraine as much as we can. Now, I don't know which one to believe, because this is a very short span. What could have possibly happened in about 4 or 5 days that could have changed this entire perspective? We had the visit of Olaf Scholz, Macron, and the Italian Prime Minister Draghi, who recently visited Kiev and probably dangled a candidacy membership status to the Ukraine into the European Union. Now, that is a carrot which I may put across very, very bluntly. Switzerland has said it can't happen because there are various problems in Ukraine. Macron has been reportedly saying that it cannot happen. And Switzerland actually says that it cannot happen, as there have been other countries that have been sitting on the fence for the past 20 years. Plus, as a matter of fact, Turkey is a prime example. The situation, as I said, in Donbass is critical, and there are reports about Russians carrying out attacks from the Black Sea into the port city of Odessa, which is a very, very important port for both Ukraine and potentially Russia if they want to take it over, as it connects to a breakaway Moldovan region called Transnistria or Piednestrovia. Now, if they take over this entire port city of Odessa, it basically cuts off Ukraine from any access to any sea and makes it a landlocked country. In a city called Severodonetsk, there's a fight which has been going on between the Ukrainians and the Russians for the past about 2 weeks, and reports that Ukrainian army have kind of gone and settled down in a chemical plant called the Azot chemical plant, reminiscent to what happened in the port city of Mariupol. One of the sad truths about this war is the pumping of, the mindless pumping of Western weapons into Ukraine. And there were reports that were put across by Western media outlets themselves, which talk about US weapons being sold on the dark web by the Ukrainians to earn a quick buck. How much of that is actually happening, God alone knows, because there's been opposition within the US about providing weapons without a check and balance sort of a structure being created within Ukraine. One of the things is that I'd like to talk about is the factor that there was a news report that talked about the Biden administration telling its people to kind of tone down the rhetoric in terms of Ukraine and the anti-Russian rhetoric, because I guess they're trying to now switch the narrative because they see the Russians in a pretty strong position and a comeback of the Ukrainians seems to be a little out of the cards at the moment. But the future is obviously uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. If I'm wanting to put my money on it, I would say that the Russians are pretty strong in that entire region. Vladimir Putin, in his recent address in the St. Petersburg, International Economic Forum, actually brushed off the economic sanctions by calling them stupid, and actually pointed out the entire economic blowback on towards the West. He attributed this to mindless printing of money and infusing it into their own countries by the United States and the EU. I will put out the figures on your screens now. And he also talked about bad economic policies in terms of handling the pandemic and the post-pandemic era. They've been trying to kind of, sort out this grain issue between Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of the world, because the world today faces a food crisis. As a matter of fact, there were reports on Sunday of major protests taking place in various different parts of Europe. There are reports of a workers' union strike in the UK. There are reports of some rail strike happening in the UK, and there were reports of some major protests taking place in Belgium as well. What I see out of this, and I'm not an economic expert, but one thing that I can see is that these sanctions that have been thoughtlessly, if I may, imposed on Russia have not gone the way that the West had thought them to go. Today, we see the Russian economy kind of stabilizing, where the rest of the world is increasing interest rates. The Russians have brought it down to pretty much pre-special military operation, invasion, war, or however you may want to call it, levels. They've found good markets for their oil with Africa, with Southeast Asia, with China, and of course with India. It is critical for the world to recognize history, for the world to recognize what the reality of the situation is and react accordingly. We see the West kind of losing a bit of a ground in terms of the narrative which was created, the hype that was created for the Ukraine war. And today we see tricklets of news coming out which talks about Ukraine having to kind of make adjustments to settle this issue with Russia, for the world to kind of move forward and try and not go into a global recession. That's all for now for me this week. Thank you so much for joining me. It'll be really nice for me to hear your feedback about the various different news articles and the news snippets I've got collected for you today. All I try to do is to put across to you news that does not feature in the mainstream media headlines, just to keep you all updated as to what's happening with India and major interests of India around the world. I'd like to request you to subscribe to my channel, share these videos with your friends and family, and do like and comment this particular video. Thank you so much. Till next time, Jai Hind.